Three young women from Washington, D.C. thought they were going to a party. Instead, they were driven to their deaths on a frozen January night in 1996. Tamika Black, 19, Tanji Jackson, 21, Mishann Chinn, 23, all shot and left beside a lonely Maryland highway, their lives snuffed out before dawn. 25 years later, at 1:23 a.m. on January 16th, 2021, Dustin Higgs will become the 13th and final person executed under Donald Trump's administration. But here's what makes this case extraordinary. Higgs never pulled the trigger. The man who actually fired the shots, he's serving life in prison. The prosecution's own witnesses testified that Willie Haynes was the shooter. Yet Higgs received the death penalty, while Haynes avoided it entirely. How does the mastermind get executed while the gunman lives? The answer lies in a federal courtroom where prosecutors painted Higgs as a puppet master behind a night of violence that began with rejection and ended with three families shattered forever. Where defense attorneys argued their client was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Where a jury had to decide, does ordering a killing deserve the same punishment as committing one? But Higgs took his secrets with him. As the pentobarbital flowed through his veins, his final words echoed to the execution chamber. "I'd like to say I am an innocent man. I did not order the murders." He named each victim before declaring his innocence one last time. Was he telling the truth? Or was this the final manipulation of a man who had spent 25 years on federal death row? Behind the walls of federal death row in Terre Haute, Indiana, Dustin John Higgs spent 25 years contemplating a night that destroyed multiple families, including his own. Born on March 10, 1972, Dustin entered a world that would test his resilience from the very beginning. His childhood was marked by profound loss. When Dustin was just 10 years old, cancer took his mother away, leaving him adrift in a world that suddenly felt much colder and more uncertain. The father who should have been his anchor remained largely absent from his life, leaving the grieving child to navigate his formative years without the stability most children take for granted. After his mother's death, Dustin went to live with extended family members who tried their best to provide the love and guidance he desperately needed. But tragedy seemed to follow him. During these years living with relatives, he witnessed several more deaths, some of them violent, creating a pattern of loss that would shape his understanding of mortality and family bonds. School became another challenge. Dustin had to repeat second grade, though he would go on to become an average student who managed to graduate despite the emotional turbulence at home. Teachers and classmates remember him as quiet, someone who kept his struggles hidden beneath a reserved exterior. Friends from his teenage years describe a young man who craved acceptance and belonging. Having lost so much so early, Dustin seemed drawn to relationships that promised stability and loyalty. He was the type of person who would go to great lengths to maintain friendships, sometimes making poor decisions in his desire to be included and valued. By his early 20s, Dustin was working steady jobs and trying to build something resembling a normal life. He had relationships, maintained employment, and appeared to be moving past the traumas of his youth. Those who knew him during this period saw someone who was genuinely trying to create the stable family life he had never experienced as a child. But the seeds of that January night in 1996 were already being planted. The combination of his deep need for acceptance, his history of loss, and his association with individuals who would ultimately lead him down a path of no return was creating a perfect storm that none of them could have anticipated. The mid-1990s Washington, D.C. metropolitan area was a complex landscape of opportunity and danger, prosperity and struggle. For young adults like Dustin Higgs, the region offered both legitimate paths forward and darker alternatives that promised quick money and easy acceptance. Dustin was living in the Maryland suburbs, part of a social circle that included both law-abiding citizens and individuals involved in various illegal activities. The drug trade was flourishing in certain neighborhoods, and for someone with Dustin's background marked by loss, financial instability, and a deep desire to belong, the allure of easy money and instant respect was powerful. During this period, Dustin became connected to Willie Haynes, a man whose violent tendencies would eventually become central to the most significant night of both their lives. Their friendship developed around shared interests and mutual associates, but it would prove to be the most consequential relationship either man would ever form. The social scene they moved and revolved around parties, clubs, and gatherings where young men and women from the area would come together. It was a world where reputations mattered, where perceived slights could escalate quickly, and where the line between having fun and making dangerous decisions was often razor thin. Dustin was working legitimate jobs during this time, but he was also drawn into the periphery of illegal activities through his associations. He wasn't a career criminal or a violent person by nature, but he was someone who wanted to be seen as important, as someone who mattered in his social circle. January 26, 1996 began as an ordinary Friday evening in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, the kind of night when young people across the region were making plans, meeting friends, and looking forward to weekend adventures. For Dustin Higgs, now 23 years old, the evening started with drinks alongside his friend Willie Haynes and their associate Victor Gloria. The trio had decided to visit an apartment complex in Laurel, Maryland, where they knew some young women who might welcome their company. What none of them could have imagined was that this seemingly routine social visit would transform into a night that would haunt families, challenge the justice system, and ultimately cost multiple lives across the span of 25 years. Tamika Black, just 19 years old, embodied the hopes and dreams of her generation. She was vibrant and ambitious, someone who saw her current circumstances not as limitations, but as stepping stones towards something greater. Her friends knew her as someone who approached life with enthusiasm and determination, always planning for a future that seemed bright with possibility. Tanji Jackson, 21, possessed a kind of infectious laugh that could lift spirits and brighten even difficult days. She was known throughout her social circle for her unwavering loyalty to friends and her ability to see the best in people, even when others might have given up on them. Her presence brought warmth to gatherings and comfort to those who needed support. Mishann Chinn, 23, was the type of person who seemed to carry light with her wherever she went. Friends and family would later describe her as someone who genuinely believed in second chances and redemption, who looked for the good in others even when experience might have taught her to be more cautious. She had a gift for making people feel valued and understood. On that Friday evening, these three women were enjoying a quiet night together at their apartment, perhaps sharing stories, making plans, or simply appreciating companionship that close friendships provide. When Higgs, Haynes, and Gloria arrived, the atmosphere initially seemed friendly and social, the kind of casual visit that was common among their extended circle of acquaintances. However, according to testimony that would later emerge during court proceedings, the evening took a darker turn when Higgs made romantic advances toward the women that were clearly and firmly rejected. This rejection, rather than being accepted gracefully, apparently triggered something dangerous within the group dynamic that had developed between the three men. The women, demonstrating both wisdom and courage, recognized that the atmosphere had shifted from friendly to potentially threatening. They asked their visitors to leave, exercising their right to control who remained in their home, and attempting to defuse what they sensed was becoming a volatile situation. What happened next would become the centerpiece of intense legal debates that would continue for decades. According to witness testimony and court records, rather than respecting the women's clear request to depart, Higgs allegedly used persuasion or coercion to convince all three women to leave with him. He claimed they were going to another party, a social gathering that would be fun and safe. The women, perhaps hoping to defuse the growing tension or genuinely believing they were being invited to a legitimate social event, made the fateful decision to get into the vehicle with the three men. This choice, made under circumstances that remain disputed, would be the last decision any of them would ever make. Instead of heading to a party, the car traveled to the Maryland countryside to the Patuxent Research Refuge in Prince George's County. This federal wildlife sanctuary, established as a safe haven for birds and other creatures, would become the site of unthinkable violence that would destroy multiple families and challenge fundamental assumptions about justice and responsibility. In the early morning hours of January 27, 1996, all three women were shot multiple times and abandoned beside a desolate stretch of road within the refuge boundaries. Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishann Chinn died in that remote location. Their promising lives ended abruptly and violently, their families' worlds forever altered by grief and loss. The case's complexity emerges from one undisputed fact. Willie Haynes was a shooter. Multiple witnesses, including Haynes himself in various statements, confirmed that he was the person who actually pulled the trigger. Yet in a twist that would confound legal observers for decades, Higgs would ultimately receive the death penalty, while Haynes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The federal courthouse in Greenbelt, Maryland became ground zero for a legal battle that would reshape how America thinks about responsibility and punishment. Victor Gloria, the third man present that night, took the witness stand and testified that Higgs had orchestrated everything: the kidnapping, the drive to the refuge, and ultimately the order to kill. Prosecutors painted Higgs as a puppet master who manipulated Willie Haynes into becoming his executioner. Under federal law, they argued, someone who directs a kidnapping that ends in murder deserves the same punishment as the person who pulls the trigger. The government's narrative was compelling. Higgs is a mastermind who kept his hands clean while orchestrating 3 murders. But Higgs' defense team exposed a glaring contradiction at the heart of the prosecution's case. If their client was truly the architect of these murders, why was Willie Haynes, the man everyone agreed had fired the shots, sitting in a different courthouse receiving life in prison instead of facing execution? How could the alleged mastermind receive a harsher sentence than the actual killer? The jury faced an impossible task. Determining degrees of guilt when facts remained murky and the stakes couldn't be higher. They heard conflicting stories, weighed competing narratives, and ultimately decided that Higgs bore primary responsibility for the 3 deaths. Their verdict recommending death sent shockwaves through legal circles, establishing a precedent that would haunt American jurisprudence for decades. 25 years of appeals revealed cracks in the foundation of Higgs' conviction. Victor Gloria, the star witness whose testimony had sealed Higgs' fate, eventually recanted key portions of his story. He admitted that federal agents had pressured him to exaggerate Higgs' role, calling the government's case complete bullshit. This stunning reversal should have triggered a new trial, but appellate courts ruled that Gloria's confession came too late to matter. Meanwhile, the disparity in sentences became increasingly difficult to justify. Haynes lived while Higgs faced execution. Gloria received a reduced sentence for cooperation. Only Higgs would pay with his life. As January 2021 approached, legal scholars and civil rights organizations joined Higgs' attorneys in questioning whether executing someone for murders they didn't commit violated basic principles of proportional justice. The Trump administration's rushed execution schedule, ending a 17-year federal moratorium, left little time for proper review of such complex moral questions. Despite mounting evidence of prosecutorial pressure and witness recantation, federal courts refused to intervene. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, proved impossible to stop. The federal execution chamber in Terre Haute, Indiana, had been the site of 12 other executions during the final months of the Trump presidency. On January 16, 2021, it would claim one more life before the incoming Biden administration could implement its promised moratorium on federal executions. Dustin Higgs spent his final day, as he had spent many others during his quarter century on death row, maintaining his innocence and trying to make peace with a fate he continued to insist he didn't deserve. Prison officials noted that he remained calm and cooperative, showing no signs of the violent tendencies that prosecutors had attributed to him decades earlier. For his last meal, Higgs requested a final bit of comfort food that connected him to happier times: a large pizza, some chicken wings, and a strawberry milkshake. It was a kind of meal that might remind him of times when his biggest worry was what to eat for dinner, not whether he would live to see another sunrise. As the evening progressed, Higgs met with his spiritual advisor and spoke with family members who had stood by him throughout his long journey through the federal justice system. These conversations, private and sacred, gave him an opportunity to express love for those he was leaving behind and to seek whatever peace was possible in his final hours. The execution protocol called for Higgs to be moved to a holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber, where he would spend his final minutes before being escorted to Gurney, where he would receive a lethal injection of pentobarbital. The drug, which had replaced earlier 3-drug protocols, was designed to render him unconscious before stopping his heart. At approximately 1:23 a.m. on January 16, 2021, with witnesses present as required by federal law, Dustin Higgs was given the opportunity to make his final statement. His words, captured by those present and later reported by media outlets, reflected the stance he had maintained for 25 years. "I'd like to say I am an innocent man," Higgs declared, his voice steady despite the circumstances. He then named each of the 3 women whose murders had brought him to this moment: Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishann Chinn, acknowledging their lives and their families' pain while maintaining that he had not been responsible for their deaths. His final words concluded with one last declaration of innocence before the pentobarbital began flowing to the 4-line in his arm. Within minutes, the man who had spent over half his life on federal death row was pronounced dead, becoming the 13th and final person executed during the Trump administration's unprecedented spree of federal executions.